Boom! What's up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. I'm your host, Alan Sakyan. Really pumped to be talking about the recent episode of Joe Rogan Experience, number 1203. Eric Weinstein joined Joe Rogan, and it was so freaking powerful. They covered a bunch of different profoundly interesting subjects. It was a really strong knowledge synthesis. It's a whole new era. It's a whole new ballpark of being able to communicate really interesting wisdom through this medium that is long form conversation, 4 hours of it. I took a lot of notes. I'm really excited to continue unpacking the nuance with you and further synthesizing the knowledge and spending some time on some of the really key points and going deeper into them. So I left a pretty funny comment on the video, which was that people have started to make the middle name like Joe blank Rogan, Eric blank Weinstein. So I left a couple. I said Eric Obligate Siblicidide Naskabooby Weinstein, Eric Hopf Fibrations Weinstein, Eric Sepak Takraw Weinstein. So I just kept writing those because I thought it was so funny that these different subjects that were covered were so diverse and so interesting. And we're going to cover them right now. And I want to jump in by saying that I think Eric is one of the best knowledge synthesizers out there right now. And he's doing a really good job at making really complex information relatable to the general public. And that's an extremely important trait to embody. And then Joe's doing an incredible job at being a show host and just bringing on these different people and rolling through them in these complex conversations. So, all right, to the beginning of their episode, they started talking about virtue signaling and vice signaling. And I thought this was really interesting because I haven't even heard of the term vice signaling before. So, as you guys probably know, virtue signaling is when you're purposely trying to make it clear to people that you believe in something. When I say like I don't wear any jewelry and stuff, that can be seen as virtue signaling. That I'm saying that I don't wear jewelry because I believe this certain way or that certain way, and that's a whole different thing to unpack in its nuance. Because I think there is some good to doing stuff like that. Vice signaling, on the other hand, is someone like Dan Bilzerian, who's a poker guru, poker champ, poker prodigy, whatever you want to call it. And Dan is kind of a playboy in many ways. And when somebody would tell Dan and say like, Dan, well, you're such a playboy. You have sex with so many different women in Los Angeles. Dan would say things like, yeah, that's right, I am a playboy. So it's vice signaling. It's like when someone is trying to poke at you, you just embody it and say, yeah, that's right. That's who I am. That's what I do. And so it's become something that it's very interesting to put a flag in that area because it's, and take Jake Paul as another example. Jake in their boxing match that they just finished up with, he had a fuck Jake Paul necklace. So again, they were chanting fuck Jake Paul over and over again. What did he do? He just put a necklace on. He made a necklace that said that and put it on. So there's all of these different types of ways to vice signal, and it's getting really interesting to sort of unpack that and understand it better. So it's almost like nobody can make fun of you. And Eric gave this really good example in the Castro. There was a sign that said, in San Francisco Castro, he said, free food, naked servers, false advertising. And so when you see that sign, you instantly trust people. It's like taking on extreme ownership and having brutal honesty and self-critique and being able to look in a mirror and whatnot. Then there was a very interesting segue into fires, into how Joe had to leave from his home and go into a hotel, and how they started realizing that if first of all, people are trying to like save their houses, people are dying, people's houses are burning. This is very intense, the California wildfire stuff. And then they realized that by going with other friends that are local in their neighborhoods into like hotels and being just like, room by room next to each other, instead of 3,000 square foot houses that are acres away from each other, there was a different sense of community that occurred. And so I want us to think about that and challenge the way that we think about living in such segregated 3,000 square foot houses or more mansions, and just having all these extra rooms and square footage for ourselves that we don't even use, that doesn't even bring us connection and family in many ways, and friends. So they got into a really interesting point about emotional intelligence that I think is really important to unpack, that EQ and emotional intelligence doesn't yet have all of its bugs worked out. And one of the things about that is that if you take a look at the priority of social intelligence, social emotional intelligence, and the world is going higher and higher, that's more and more important. And I totally agree with that. Then there's this notion of neural diversity. There's kids that only want to sit behind a computer and code or watch evolution videos and not talk to other humans. And then there's kids like Jojo Siwa, who is super bubbly, super enthusiastic, super energetic. She's 15 and a half, and she's running around selling 40 million bows a year across retail stores on her brand and stuff. So total different neural diversity there, total different human beings. And so what I thought was interesting was that people give each other shit to build intimacy. For example, Ron and I give each other shit all the time. And that builds a lot of rapport and intimacy together, versus if you see how, you can see how that could be taken as bullying, when if someone's giving someone else shit, that someone could say, don't give them shit. They feel sad, they feel upset, they feel hurt, they feel pain, misery, etc. And that can be very, it's a line that we don't know how to explore yet, because I can totally see how someone can get sad from someone else giving them shit because they don't know how to give shit back. But at the same time, that's a way to build intimacy and trust and rapport with someone else, when you can kind of edge each other up a little bit. And women do this, men do this, and it's very interesting how that builds rapport. And I think we should explore that more within social emotional intelligence. Okay, think about this. So when you actually are doing really crazy things, it really ends up in becoming imprinted into your neural circuitry and architecture way more than if you are doing mundane things. So if you're going around and you're doing some normal, repetitive, suburban, or even metropolitan activity, that you will have a higher propensity to go into a loop in software, in code, that the code is just looping, versus if you're doing what is a Rube Goldberg moment with your code, a moment of huge creative spark, or something that you will never replicate again because it's so profoundly interesting. So this is something that you can look at people like Logan Paul, like Jake Paul, that go out and just do crazy, crazy things, and they do them over and over again because it creates the most vivid experience possible that is not a repetitive experience. Like our show, we aim to do the same thing. We have a different, profoundly interesting guest across a different subject area on as often as possible, and then we gain different wisdoms and knowledge from them that then again creates a different neural pattern for us every single day. So we're not stuck in the same habits and flows. And this is what a lot of us did in our childhood when we grew up in places that didn't have fun things to do. We made our own fun. And it was actually quite interesting to make our own fun. We came out with the most creative, wild, hilarious things to do. All right, there was this moment when they started talking about the emotional intelligence behind a human that decided that they wanted to to start labeling themselves with a bunch of different, labels, because that's how they identified. I believe it was something like they're British, they're Iraqi, they're gay, they're non-binary, they're Muslim, and they have a bunch of makeup on, and so again, you're welcome to totally identify as, whoever you want to identify as. I think if someone wants to identify as an animal, I think that's, I guess, okay. But at the same time, I think it's important for someone to be like, well, why do you identify yourself as an animal? Or why do you identify yourself with these 6 distinct identity types and personalities? Like, how do you feel as a human that makes you identify that way? When someone, and Eric touched on this too, Eric is kind of, he finds makeup to be a strange thing, and I do too, actually, where when you look at someone's face and you see that they have these layers of makeup on, that when you look at them, they almost look like a different person. And then you see past their makeup and you kind of see them for, what do they look like without makeup? It's a very, very strange thing. And I kind of experienced that too. And so it'd be like, why are you wearing so much makeup? Why do you choose to do that? Why is that of interest? And so again, it's about asking these questions and learning and potentially giving some elbows and nudges and shooting the shit a little bit. All right. So I think this was a very interesting point. Men wear ties, women wear heels. This is becoming a very interesting thing to understand, because a man will go out of his way to wear something that totally just constricts their neck in a very uncomfortable way, and for status in the business world, that they are accomplished, they have authority, stuff like that. Whereas a woman will wear heels, again, extremely uncomfortable, crushing their toes into a triangle and putting their heels up like that so that they can get taller, accentuate their legs and their hips. But they can't run anywhere if they get into trouble or danger. It's extremely uncomfortable after wearing them for so long, just like a tie is. And so the way that we do these things, they signal certain things, and it's important for us to really question makeup, heels, ties, different social and cultural norms that have been programmed, and that we want to explore what life is like without them, or what life is like with different cultural norms that we find exciting to play with. So it was kind of funny how Eric started poking at Joe about Joe fighting and about fighting culture, because fighting is very interesting, and we've done a couple episodes of thoughts on the McGregor Khabib fight, and we talk about how important it is that fighting, and especially like jiu-jitsu, is crazy interesting, because it's like chess, except even more complicated, because you're doing it in close quarter combat, and there's not a restricted set of moves and whatnot. And then furthermore it's like extremely, it's like strength. Your body's very, very strong and healthy then. But not if you're boxing and you're getting your head concussed all the time. That's not healthy, right? So it's very, very strange in that sense. And so Eric and Joe were kind of, going back and forth on that for a while, and I thought that was really interesting, where if you do end up going and finishing a very good fight and you feel very strong, or you finish a good hike and you didn't give up halfway through the hike, it's another time to nudge your friend, like, yo, you're sitting down after 1 hour of hiking. We have 2 more hours of hiking ahead of us. You're gonna feel incredible when you finish this hike. Do it. Same thing with the workout. When you're fighting, that finish it out. Give people nudges so that they grow, and that they can achieve their goals that they set for themselves. This is a practice of conscientiousness and accountability with other humans. And so Joe talked about something that I think, regarding fighting, that I think we should all consider to be extremely important. It is that within fighting, people are cutting weight so they can fight at lower weight classes. And Joe said that the solutions to this are to have more weight classes and to do more regulation around hydration testing. And I think that's a fantastic idea. Joe's right in this case, is that if you have more weight classes, it's easier for people to fight in these different classes, and also hydration testing, so they're not just cutting weight drastically for weigh-ins and then going in as a bigger individual and potentially, harming someone else as a smaller individual in that sense. So that's a very good point that Joe brought up, and he's at the forefront of that, which is interesting. Okay, then they got into physics, which I thought was an interesting segue. Again, this is super polymathic, super multidisciplinary, and so they segued into physics. They started talking about singularity being at the center of a black hole. There's a singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang. There's a singularity when humans digitize consciousness. There's a bunch of these different sorts of singularities that we talk about. And there's a really important thing about storytelling. It's like, what is reality? What is it? Well, are we talking about emotions and like how humans interact? Are we talking about physics and how and atoms and quantum mechanics? What are we talking about? And they went deep into the physics side of things. So they started talking about quantum mechanics, started talking about being able to ask about, where is the center of the wave, and like a wave crashing into a shoreline. And that question doesn't really make sense, because the wave kind of goes on and on and on. There's not really a center, right? And then they asked another question like, well, what about the speed of that wave as the wave is going at a particular point that's going to the shore? Well, you can actually measure that. So there's these interesting things about being able to measure things that are questions about reality and things that you can't really measure. There's like a bad question and a good question. And I'm really starting to try and understand this better, because it's really tough to get this field. And this is when they jumped into understanding the Hopf Fibration and gauge theory, which was nuts. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. We've had awesome people on the show before, like Clee Irwin and Garrett Lisi. Eric mentioned Garrett Lisi on the show. And when we've sat down with them, you guys can go and watch these episodes where we sat down with them. They're trying to explain to us the absolute kind of fundamentals of quantum mechanics. And it's extremely difficult. Those are some of the only shows where I feel like a 5-year-old. Like, I don't get anything that they're talking about. And I just try and get it. Okay, here's an atom. Okay, protons, neutrons, electrons. Okay, break that down further. Okay, break that down further. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And that's how we try to understand it. And this sort of visualization of a Hopf Fibration, I'm still trying to understand this better. And and here's the thing is that, it was actually interesting that, Eric gave really good examples. And I was just messaging Garrett Lisi earlier today and asking him about this, and he messaged me back. He's like, Alan, I'm a physicist. I can't simplify things for you like that. And but he did a pretty good job on the show. And I'm curious as to if other knowledge synthesizers in the world, that this is their color. This is their gig. This is where they're supposed to be. This is where they're supposed to go. They're the ones that are supposed to identify these fields where there are brilliant people that don't know how to communicate the knowledge in the most relatable way to the public. And so that's a science communicator. That's a knowledge synthesizer. And so I think there's a growing need for that in our world. And so this is a good example of that. So Eric gave these really, really interesting ways of understanding gauge theory. And in his understanding of gauge, he made these points about reference levels and how that, I believe, related to the Hopf Fibration. That when you take something like Mount Everest and you ask, well, where does Mount Everest, how tall is it? 29,000 feet. Okay, well, where does the sea level start? And you're like, well, you have to look at it from a geoid perspective, and because there's no sea level right there where Mount Everest is. And so it's okay, fine. So it's like it's a point, it's a reference level, right? And so that reference level is how they can measure Mount Everest. And so the same notion applies to a reference level in getting paid. Eric made this really good point, is that if you're getting paid every single month, if you're getting paid, let's say $1,000 a month, and that inflation is increasing, so that that you would need to start asking your boss, instead of for $1,000 a month, you would need to ask her or him for $1,000 of purchasing power every single month, or for an equivalent amount of purchasing power every month. So if inflation increases and the price of the groceries at the store go up a little bit, but you're only getting $1,000 the next month, you don't have the same purchasing power. So you have to have a reference level that is that you want your income every month from your work to increase with the price of inflation over time, so that way you have the same amount of purchasing power every single month. That's a really good understanding and notion of this. And it has a lot to do with, it's a reference level for rise over run, which is just a classic sort of mathematical concept. That one's really easy to understand. I really think that measuring rise over run based on a custom level, this reference point, I think that's interesting. And Eric, I would love to hear more examples of gauge theory from you. I'd love to hear more explanations of the Hopf Fibration from you. We'd love to see you on Joe Rogan's show again soon. All right. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on, because quantum mechanics is so far past my knowledge. Okay, let's move on to Sepak Takraw. This was kind of funny. On the way, how did they get there though? It was interesting because Eric made these questions. When and where are humans? Who and what is involved to make reality? And how and why did we get here? And these sort of questions are questions that physicists answer, that anthropologists answer, that different scientists and sociologists and just synthesizers of reality answer. And we need to have a coherent, cohesive story that we can disseminate to children, so that when they come into the world, they go, oh, I get it. I get, why we're here, what we're doing, how to prosper, how to actualize. And we've been talking about needing that for a long time. So Sepak Takraw was a strange transition, because they're like, if you go to the beach with a ball and a net, that, you're like, oh, they're going to play volleyball. But no, you can play Sepak Takraw, which is where it's like this super interesting way to play a sport with a ball that is, you play with your feet and your chest and your head and stuff. And look at this, they all do like bicycle kicks in order to hit the ball across. And it's such an interesting sport that's played in Southeast Asia. And I was watching some of it last night because I thought it was super interesting. And it's going to be in the Olympics, I think not this next Olympics, but the following one. And look at that. Look at how tough it is to play that sport. It's so interesting. All right. All right. Now, and this is why I write Eric Sepak Takraw Weinstein, because I think it's so interesting seeing that. Eric Sepak Takraw Weinstein, so interesting. So funny that there are so many of these different things that were discussed that are so diverse from each other. Okay, Eric and Joe kept talking about these portals to new areas of perception, like when Eric talked about the square root of -1, that there, that what two numbers multiply to that, square root of 81 is 9, 9 times 9 is 81, etc. That that again, it takes you to a new portal. It takes you to a new area of thinking. When I talk about the 100 billion humans that lived and died, to build civilization, you have to kind of move your head back to the past and look at how civilization was made by other people. Again, that's a portal to a new area of perception. And we were talking about that with Ron on the way today to our Thanksgiving meal. We were talking about this notion of meditation, psychedelics, different experiences that lead us to new ways of perceiving reality, and that being extremely, extremely important. And that these things are that children are, these neurodiverse children are in some ways being called that they have like learning disabilities and things like that. But really, Eric's right, our teaching system is not enabling all the neurodiverse kids to flourish in their own unique ways. And we gotta get used to that, because there's more and more diversity coming out with kids in the way that they think and use technology. And so we have to train our educational systems to be able to adapt to that and help actualize them into the world. And so teaching about things like the Hopf Fibration and we're gonna talk about some of these other crazy things like Siblicides and whatnot, Obligate Siblicides, and that these things, they rattle the hierarchy, they cause upheavals in the hierarchy. Ron and I talk about this all the time. We talk about how there's a certain amount of systematic violence and oppressive economic dynamics that persist in the hierarchy, which unfortunately they're negative for society. And as you educate young people, especially the rich, the greedy, sorry, not rich, but just the greedy and the corrupt, they do not like that. And so that they see it as an upheaval in the hierarchy, and that's not good to their money, to the way that they are causing some of the systematic violence. So shattering through those structural oppressions and going forth for full actualization of everyone is super duper important. All right, let's move on to, I thought this was very interesting, the 10,000 hours idea. So if there's a sign that says that you have to have 10,000 hours of interviewing to be able to host a show, that some people will say that, okay, well, that means I have to interview for 10,000 hours. Well, what I'll say is that I have to interview really freaking smart people, and I have to practice IQ and EQ, polymath and empath, every single day for hours every day. And then instead of that sign saying 10,000 hours, for me, I can maybe get there in 2,000 hours. Same thing with someone that wants to get into physics, or someone that wants to become a painter. If you paint in a way where you study the top echelon of painters in the world, and you study them for thousands, like 1,000 or 2,000 hours, you will probably you'll be able to walk through that 10,000 hour door way faster, because some people spend 10,000 hours painting and they may study other painters that really didn't make that much influence on society, which in some ways could be useful because it's more novel or something, but you get the point. You can bring that 10,000 hour sign down depending on what you do with hacking it. And it's kind of crazy that, things like, Eric recommending that we all start using the harmonica, not we all, but that because it's something, it's like a little pocket instrument that you can bring with you and play, and it's unique in the sense. Joe's talking about how there's only maybe 1,000 comedians on the planet, and Eric's talking about there's only 1,000 physicists on the planet that understand the true highest level of being able to write Netflix specials, or being able to understand the Hopf Fibration, that kind of stuff. And so can you find yourself in the top 1,000 people in a certain field? Maybe that's being a polymath and rather than a specialist, a generalist. Maybe that is your calling. There's so many different callings. Can you find yourself in the top of your calling is a very interesting question to ask. All right, on Siblicides. So there's this thing called obligative Siblicide, and the other thing called facultative Siblicide. So Siblicide is nuts. Basically, what happens in biology is that something like this Nazca booby, which is this bird right here that you see, will have two eggs, and then when the second egg hatches, the sibling will kill the other sibling because it was like an emergency, or it was a backup. It was like a backup. It was a second copy to see if the first one doesn't work out, or if first one gets eaten, or whatever it may be. So it kills it so that it and again, the mother just watches the sibling kill the other sibling. It's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. And so I thought this concept of obligative siblicide was crazy, and it happens in pelicans, owls, cranes, queen bees, parasitic wasps. Sand tiger sharks actually cannibalize in the womb. Spotted hyenas are kind of facultative, which means facultative siblicide means that siblicide may or may not occur based on the environmental conditions. All right. They spent a lot of time talking about things like mollusks, newts, and salamanders. I want to show you this because it's kind of crazy that they can like regrow their limbs. So newts can regrow their limbs. You know, this is what they look like. And it's nuts because they have the cells at the site of an injury have the ability to undifferentiate, reproduce rapidly, and differentiate again to create a new limb or organ. So if you think about that, how can we regenerate our limbs, our eyes, our spinal cords, our hearts, our intestines, our upper and lower jaws? It's absolutely nuts. We can potentially biomimic other species that already exist on the planet, which again is just so interesting. They were showing and so I really want to continue looking into this more, because the more that you understand biology and its complex systems, the more humans can understand themselves and the world, and further, the more we can biomimic other really smart creatures, like how the newts can do this, or how some of the best, some of the strongest neurological systems exist in sea creatures, and that's very interesting. Yeah, these pyrosomes are so cool. They were showing these pyrosomes. They were talking about them. There's this one that looks like, that looks crazy long like that. The giant pyrosome was found. I believe it was outside of New Zealand. That's where it was. It was outside New Zealand. And okay, last couple of thoughts on the way out. I know this is an extremely complicated and nuanced conversation that happened, so I want to give it as much of its due multidisciplinary diligence as possible. There was this idea of, again, Eric kind of pressed Joe on hunting a bit and was like, what's going on with hunting? And Joe's like, well, there are certain populations of animals that need to be controlled, which is true. Otherwise, they will just obliterate, like bears will obliterate the other elk and moose in certain areas. And so there's like a big difference between like setting up a bear trap versus actually going out and shooting one down with a rifle and all this other nuance, or a bow and arrow like Joe practices. It's just interesting, all of that nuance. And so, I guess, what are sort of the ethical ramifications around these things, or what are the, we've been doing it for so long as hunters and gatherers, so what is it, what has been passed down biologically through us over time? I just want to say that Eric is very playful. He's so funny, and Joe's playful too. It's just very interesting how they're, Eric's also a scientist and he's playful. Mathematician, economist, etc. So reasonable dialogue's becoming more and more popular. We see it in longer form conversations here on our show, on Joe Rogan's show, and I think that's very interesting that we have these longer form reasonable dialogues that are popping up around the world. A very scary thing is the idea of exclusion, that Twitter, YouTube, etc. do things like, they banned Alex Jones. They Google fired James Damore, and just these ideas of exclusion. They have chief inclusionary officers. Well, what about the chief exclusionary officers? The ones that are trying to identify these threats that exist and exclude them from using the platforms, which is kind of crazy that that's currently happening. So here's an interesting statistic. Out of the 535 senators and representatives in the US Congress, we have 12,719 lobbyists, apparently. That means there's 23 registered Washington lobbyists per each congressman or woman. What? 23 lobbyists per congressman or woman? That's a lot of money that is moving into congressmen and women's pockets that we were not expecting when we first made the Constitution and the judicial systems of our legislative systems of our government in the US. So we've went way past 1776 into 2018, now approaching 19, where things are completely different in governance structures, completely different. Way more money being funneled into governmental influence now. So we have to be very digging deep into this and following things up, because we're moving away from mainstream media sources. There's an inverse relationship between the amount of information technology and internet access that's been increasing in the world and the amount of people that watch mainstream media news outlets. So mainstream media is decreasing as well, while things like YouTube are picking up. More and more people are now getting their news from things like podcasts, vodcasts, news feeds on Google and Facebook, rather than maybe some of the mainstream CNN, Fox, and whatnot. Taking in all of these perspectives. So for example, like Eric, it would be very interesting, Eric to start a vodcast as well. I've urged Sam Harris to start doing video on his show. Jordan Peterson could start one as well. Elon Musk could start one. People like Michelle Obama or Jennifer Doudna or other prominent women could start one, and that would be very interesting. Melinda Gates. And that would be very interesting, I think. And I think it would pick up quite well in the world. If like Xi Jinping in China started one, that would be very interesting to see what they would talk about. Like if they sat down with Putin and they talked on the show about how to best, collaborate and move forward. People have gotten on me a little bit recently about wanting to potentially get the United Nations General Assembly to all agree to take psychedelics together and to meditate together. I don't think that's a goal that's too far out of our future. I think that is a very possible future that we have together. And I think that's how to get to a place of world peace and love. And we'll see if that actually ends up happening. Eric made a really important point about taking all of these perspectives in and finding incompatibilities. So rather than saying like, hey, no, like that perspective doesn't mesh with that other perspective, you can take in you can ask them to, give me all your perspectives, then they show you all their perspectives. Then what you do is you say, okay, now where are your first principles? How do these two things exist when they're incompatible in this example? And so that's a good way to get people to kind of understand that the first principles can't just mix and match between things and change up and whatnot. So, okay, last couple of thoughts.
You said that 10 minutes ago.
I don't want to
do 40-minute fucking thoughts on it.
I know this one's quite long, but this is also a very long podcast. There was a lot to talk about on this one.
40-minute fucking thoughts on it.
It can be a little long sometimes, but I'll finish this up. Colbert is one of the people that actually could potentially start a podcast himself. Just like Bill Maher could potentially not start a podcast himself, Tucker Carlson couldn't start a podcast himself. And I think it's important to remember that the reason why these guys can't start podcasts themselves is because they are obliged to their mainstream media outlets. And Eric called that out, Joe called that out. Joe kind of, said that might not be true in some ways, but Eric, pushed on that, which I thought was really interesting, because it's a good point that these sort of late night talk show hosts couldn't start a vodcast because they have only the ability to talk in such a small amount of time, like 5 or 7 minute segments, and they're restricted by all of the components of the multi-million-dollar sets and executive producers and stuff, that they can only speak in such small amounts of available perspective versus what a 4-hour conversation can take you. The example that was given was like Stephen Colbert, like you're Catholic, but the Catholic Church has been in big trouble for the way that they treat children, the way that what's going on with the sex with children and stuff. And the way that Colbert would reply to that could potentially risk his job. And so that's what Eric was pointing at. I thought that was interesting. The only person that mainstream media is currently playing with from the intellectual dark web is Jordan Peterson. They're like sending their best fighters against Jordan Peterson right now, but they're not really challenging anyone else. I think there's going to be more challenging of the IDW in the future, and I look forward to watching that more and to seeing how that all plays out. There's something crazy going on with follower counts right now that people like Jack from Twitter and Kanye have said things like, you don't want your social security number written on your chest or the amount of money in your bank account, and that's the same thing as having your followers online. But there's a lot of nuance to that. Like, people have worked really hard to gain a lot of followers by saying important things that other people like, and so it can be kind of crazy to try and get rid of that. Because if you do get rid of that, that can lead to a lot of other problems, like someone that has a voice that's similar to someone else, where that other person's voice is not as powerful for progressing society forward in some ways. So I think that that's a very important thing to take into account. The international dork web was thrown around. I thought that was just cute and funny. Eric has a son. His name's Zev. He's 13. He has a YouTube channel with a video on it. I went and watched it. It's just a powerful Gen Z kid. There's these Gen Z kids popping out. Like Zev is more, in a way, like a little quieter, but very articulate. And then, and like JoJo Siwa is like 2 years older than him, and she is super bubbly and extroverted and loud spoken and stuff. And there's just a really interesting difference between the way that these Gen Z kids are evolving out in the US versus how a Gen Z kid evolves out in China. It's a completely different landscape for that Gen Z kid to evolve in. And there was a lot of other interesting things about Copernicus moments, finding those things that only 1% of people believe in and know. And other really cool things like I was just going and looking into how crazy it was that when I was looking at geoids and the surface of Earth and finding those reference points, I was looking at the size of things like Vesta and Ceres, which are the largest asteroids in the asteroid belt, and we're talking like 580-mile diameters. So that's like from San Francisco to San Diego, or from like Paris to Berlin. As an asteroid size. It was crazy looking at these things. So thanks everyone for watching. I hugely appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun talking to you all about this really nuanced episode of the Joe Rogan Experience featuring Eric Weinstein. Again, just remember when you think multidisciplinary. Think about all these complex perspectives that we are discussing in long form, 4-hour, these 45-minute segments, just trying to unpack what they talked about. Go and build the future. Go manifest your destiny into the world. There is so much that we need you to build and bring to it, and have these thought-provoking conversations with other people that are super nuanced. Go watch that episode. The link's in the bio. Go follow Eric and Joe. Their links are in the bio as well. Follow us. We'd love to see more of you watching episodes on our show as well. Where we do feature some of the greatest minds of our time and have nuanced conversations with them about the future of humanity. Thanks everyone. Let's rebirth the public intellectual. Join us. Thanks Ron for producing and directing, and we'll see you soon. Peace.